Scam likely, flashed across Chris K's phone screen during the most important moment of his life. Or at least what was supposed to be. He stood at the altar of Seoul's Grand Cathedral wearing a custom black suit, about to marry Jessica Newman, daughter of Newman Industries. The merger marriage his family had orchestrated for months. Every camera in the room was pointed at him. 500 guests from Korea's elite families and mafia networks watched expectantly. His father's proud smile, his mother's satisfied nod, Jessica's perfect but emotionless expression as she waited for him to say, "I do." But Chris couldn't stop staring at the unknown number flashing on his phone screen for the 17th time that week. "Boss," his best man Jin whispered, shoving the phone into his hand. "Answer it. Embarrass this scammer on live TV." Chris smirked. He answered it right there, at his own wedding. "You picked the wrong day too. Mr. K?" A nurse's voice cut through. "We have Grace Norman here. She's 8 months pregnant and she collapsed outside Seoul General Hospital. She's been unconscious for 20 minutes. We found your contact listed as emergency on her phone. Are you family? We need consent for emergency procedures." The world stopped. Grace Norman. Is Grace 8 months pregnant? Pause with me for a second. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button. Your support means everything. The same Grace he fired 3 months ago when he saw her belly. The same woman he kissed one desperate night before disappearing to a conference. The woman whose gospel songs he still heard in every empty corner of his mansion. The woman he threw away because he was too much of a coward to ask if the baby was his. Sir, are you there? Where is she?" His voice came out strangled. "Seoul General, Labor and Delivery, room 304. Sir, we really need." Chris dropped the phone. He looked at Jessica, at his parents, at the 500 witnesses to his perfect, proper, loveless future. Then he ran. "Chris." His father's roar echoed through the cathedral. "Chris K, you come back here right now." But Chris was already gone. If you're loving this story so far, smash that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me what you think Chris will do next. Your support keeps these stories coming. 6 months earlier, Chris K didn't believe in hiring help. His mansion in Gangnam had 15 rooms he never used, marble floors he walked across without seeing, and a silence so thick it felt like drowning. But his mother insisted. "A man of your position can't live like a college student," she'd said. So he called an agency. Grace Norman arrived on a Tuesday morning. She wore simple clothes, black pants, white shirt, hair pulled back. She didn't flinch when she saw the tattoos crawling up his neck. Didn't stare at the scar above his eyebrow or the cold way he handed her the house keys without a single word of greeting. She just nodded, said, "Thank you, Mr. K," and got to work. Chris told himself he hired her because she was professional. Quiet, efficient. He was lying. It was her voice that cracked him open. Gospel songs, old hymns his grandmother used to hum before she died. Grace sang while she cleaned, soft and low, like she thought no one was listening. But Chris was always listening. He'd sit in his office pretending to work on Mafia business, spreadsheets of shipments and payments blurring on his screen, while her voice drifted up the stairs. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. He watched her when she didn't know. Watched the way her hips swayed as she vacuumed. Watched her dark skin glow under the afternoon light streaming through his floor-to-ceiling windows. Watched her smile to herself while she folded his clothes, like she had a secret the world couldn't touch. Chris told himself it was nothing. She was staff. He was a mafia boss. There were levels to this. Rules. Boundaries. He was lying. One evening, Grace was cleaning his kitchen when he walked in shirtless after a workout. She glanced up, then quickly looked away, her hands tightening on the dishcloth. But Chris saw the way her breath caught. Saw the way her eyes lingered on his tattooed chest for just a second too long. "You don't have to stay late," he said, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. "I know," Grace replied, still not looking at him. "But I like finishing what I start." Something in her tone made his chest tighten. Made him want to grab her wrist, pull her close, ask her if she felt it too. This dangerous thing growing between them every time they were in the same room. But he didn't. He walked away. Because Chris K was good at walking away from things that scared him. 3 weeks later, everything changed. Chris came home after a meeting that went bad. blood still under his nails, rage still burning in his veins. And Grace was there, humming in his kitchen, setting his dinner on the table like she'd been doing it her whole life. She looked up at him and didn't flinch. Didn't ask questions. Just said, "You should eat before it gets cold." That's when Chris realized he was in trouble. Because Grace Norman wasn't just beautiful. She was the kind of piece he'd been running from his entire life. And he wanted her so badly it was killing him. But wanting something and taking it are two different things. And Chris K was about to cross a line he could never uncross. The line Chris swore he'd never cross? He crossed it on a Thursday night after he killed a man. Not directly. Chris didn't pull triggers anymore. But he'd given the order, watched his men drag the traitor out of the warehouse, and drove home with someone else's blood spattered on his sleeve. He should have felt something. Regret. Guilt. Anything. But all he felt was empty. Until he walked into his kitchen and saw Grace. She was setting his dinner on the table. Grilled fish, rice, soup. Steam rising from the bowls. Her hands moved with care, like she was arranging something sacred instead of just food. When she looked up and saw him, saw the blood, saw the deadness in his eyes, she didn't scream. Didn't run. She just said, "Sit down. You need to eat." Chris's control snapped. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, grabbed her wrist, and pulled her against him. Grace gasped, her eyes going wide, but she didn't push him away. He could feel her heartbeat racing against his chest, could smell the vanilla lotion on her skin, could see the question in her eyes. "Tell me to stop," Chris whispered, his tattooed hand sliding to her waist. "Tell me this is wrong." Grace's breath came faster. Her fingers curled into his shirt. "You're my boss. I know. This could ruin everything. I know. Then why?" Chris kissed her like he was drowning and she was air. Desperate. Hungry. Like if he didn't taste her right now he'd die. Grace made a sound in her throat, something between a moan and a prayer, and kissed him back just as hard. Her hands slid up his chest, around his neck, pulling him closer even as her mind probably screamed at her to stop. They stumbled toward the stairs. Chris barely remembered how they got to his bedroom. His hands were in her hair, on her hips, pulling her shirt over her head while she fumbled with his belt. Everything was heat and need and the sound of her gospel songs echoing in his head like a hymn he'd been waiting his whole life to hear. By the time they collapsed onto his bed, breathing hard, tangled in each other, Chris knew he'd made a mistake he could never take back. But he didn't care. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, Grace's head on his chest, his fingers tracing patterns on her shoulder. For the first time in years, Chris K felt peace. By morning, he was gone. Chris woke at 5 a.m., looked at Grace sleeping beside him, her dark skin glowing in the early light, her face soft and trusting, and panicked. He had a flight to catch. A conference in Tokyo. Meetings that couldn't be missed. But that wasn't why he left. He left because he was terrified. Terrified of how right it felt to hold her. Terrified of what his family would say. Terrified that if he stayed one more minute, he'd never be able to let her go. So he dressed in silence, grabbed his suitcase, and walked out without waking her. Grace woke up alone in a bed that smelled like him, her body aching, her mind spinning. She touched the sheets where he'd been, still warm, and wondered if any of it had been real. Or if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life with a man who saw her as nothing more than a one-night regret. Chris told himself the conference would clear his head. 1 month away, and he'd forget about Grace Norman. But some things you can't forget. And some mistakes follow you home. 1 month away didn't make Chris forget. It made everything worse. He spent 30 days in Tokyo closing deals, shaking hands with Yakuza bosses, pretending his mind wasn't thousands of miles away in a mansion where a woman with a voice like Sunday Morning probably hated him. He told himself he'd done the right thing. Leaving was mercy. Grace deserved better than a tattooed criminal who couldn't even face her the morning after. But the second his driver pulled up to his Gangnam mansion, Chris's stomach twisted. Because part of him hoped she'd still be there. Still humming. Still forgiving him without words the way she always did. He walked through the front door. Grace was in the living room, dusting his bookshelves. Her back was to him. She wore the same simple black pants and white shirt. Her hair was pulled back like always. But something was different. Chris's eyes dropped to her belly. Round. Unmistakable. At least 4 months along, maybe more. The world tilted sideways. Grace turned around, saw him standing there, and froze. Her hand instinctively moved to her stomach, protective. Her eyes filled with something that looked like hope and terror mixed together. "Mr. K," she said softly. "You're back." Chris couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Math screamed in his head. 1 month ago. That night. But that would only be 1 month, not 4. Which meant, she was already pregnant when they slept together. The jealousy hit him like a bullet. Hot, blinding, irrational. Some other man had touched her. Some other man had gotten her pregnant. And Chris had been stupid enough to think that night meant something. That he meant something. "Mr. K?" Grace took a step toward him, her voice shaking. "I need to tell you." "Don't." Chris's voice came out cold. Dead. He pulled out his phone, dialed the agency with trembling fingers. "This is Chris K. I need a replacement for Grace Norman. Today. Immediately." Grace's face crumbled. "Chris, please, just listen. Pack your things." He couldn't look at her. If he looked at her, he'd break. "The agency will send someone to escort you out. It's yours." Grace's voice cracked, desperate. "Chris, the baby is." "I said pack your things." 20 minutes later, a woman from the agency arrived. Grace stood in the foyer with her small bag, tears streaming down her face, trying one last time to catch Chris's eye. But he'd locked himself in his office, staring at the wall, his tattooed hands clenched into fists. He heard the front door close, heard her gospel songs disappear from his life forever, and told himself he'd done the right thing. That a maid who got pregnant by someone else had no place in his world. That he didn't care. That the ache in his chest would fade. He was lying. Because 3 months later, Chris would be standing at an altar next to Jessica Newman, about to marry a woman he didn't love, when a phone call would destroy everything he thought he knew. Grace Norman walked out of that mansion carrying Chris K's child. But he was too blind to see it. And by the time he figured it out, it might be too late. By the time he figured it out, it might be too late. But Chris K was excellent at pretending everything was fine. It's what mafia bosses do best. 2 weeks after Grace walked out, Chris's mother introduced him to Jessica Newman at a charity gala. Blonde hair, designer dress, a smile that never reached her eyes. Daughter of Newman Industries, one of Seoul's biggest import companies. Perfect on paper, cold in person. "She's ideal for you," his mother whispered. Educated, connected, American enough to be interesting, white enough to be respectable. Chris shook Jessica's hand and felt nothing. No spark, no heat, no voice in his head singing hymns that made his chest ache. Just emptiness wrapped in expensive perfume. Perfect. They started dating 3 days later. If you could call it dating. Business dinners where they discussed mergers instead of dreams. Charity events where they smiled for cameras and never touched when the flashes stopped. Meetings with their parents where wedding plans got made without either of them actually proposing. Jessica never asked Chris about his day. Never noticed when he came home with blood under his nails. Never hummed while she moved through his mansion like it could be a home instead of a mausoleum. She was exactly what his world demanded. No mess, no complications, no risk of actually feeling something. "I think we should get engaged," Jessica said one night over dinner at Seoul's most exclusive restaurant. She said it the way someone might suggest ordering dessert. Casual, transactional. "Okay," Chris replied, because what else was there to say? They announced their engagement 2 weeks later. The press called them Seoul's power couple. His father clapped him on the back, proud for the first time in years. His mother cried happy tears and started planning a wedding that would cost more than most people made in a lifetime. Chris told himself this was what he wanted. This was smart. This was safe. This was the life a man like him deserved, calculated, controlled, and completely devoid of anything that could hurt him. But every night, when Jessica went back to her own penthouse because she needed her space, Chris lay in his empty mansion and heard Grace's voice. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. He'd walk past the kitchen where she used to cook his dinner. Past the living room where she used to dust his bookshelves while singing. Past the bedroom where they'd tangled together for one perfect night before he ruined everything. Some nights he'd pull out his phone, scroll to her blocked number, and hover his thumb over the unblock button. Wondering where she was, if she was okay, if her baby had been born yet, if she thought about him at all or if she'd forgotten him the way he was trying so desperately to forget her. Then he'd lock his phone, pour himself another drink, and go back to planning a wedding to a woman whose favorite color he didn't even know. 3 months passed like this. Chris smiled for cameras, signed contracts, pretended Jessica's cold perfection was what he'd been searching for his whole life. But you can't outrun your mistakes forever. And Grace Norman was about to crash back into his life in the most devastating way possible. Drop a like if this story is hitting different. Comment below what you think happens next, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an upload. Your support keeps these stories alive. Grace Norman was about to crash back into his life, but Chris K had blocked every road she could take to reach him. It started 3 weeks before the wedding. An unknown number flashed across Chris's phone while he was reviewing security details for the ceremony. He answered without thinking. Chris? Grace's voice was small, scared. Chris, it's me. Please don't hang up. I need to. He hung up, then blocked the number. His hands were shaking. After 3 months of silence, hearing her voice felt like a knife twisting in an old wound. He told himself she was calling to ask for money, to manipulate him, to drag him back into whatever mess she'd made with whoever got her pregnant. He told himself a lot of lies. 2 days later, a different number called. Chris was in a final cake tasting with Jessica, pretending to care about fondant versus buttercream when his phone buzzed. He stepped outside to answer. Mr. K, this is Grace Norman. I've been trying to reach you. I'm at Seoul General Hospital and there are complications with. Chris hung up, blocked that number too. Everything okay? Jessica asked when he came back inside, not actually caring about the answer. Just spam, Chris said. The calls kept coming. Different numbers. Same desperate voice. Grace called from the hospital lobby. From a nurse's phone. From a payphone outside the emergency room. Each time, Chris saw unknown number, or scam likely, flash across his screen and felt that same twist of panic and rage. Why wouldn't she leave him alone? Why couldn't she understand he'd moved on? That whatever they had was a mistake he'd buried under 3 months of expensive wine and a fiancé who would never make him feel anything. By the second week, Chris stopped answering unknown numbers entirely. His assistant screened everything. Grace's voice became background noise he trained himself not to hear. He didn't know she was 8 months pregnant and her blood pressure was climbing to dangerous levels. Didn't know the doctors had put her on bed rest and told her the baby was at risk. Didn't know she'd spent every night in that hospital bed watching his engagement photos flood Korean news sites, trying to find the courage to tell him the truth he'd refused to hear 3 months ago. That the baby was his. That she'd been 8 weeks pregnant that night they were together, too early to show, too scared to tell him because she knew what his world would do to a black maid carrying a mafia boss's child. That she'd tried to tell him the day he fired her, but he wouldn't listen. Wouldn't look at her. Wouldn't give her even 30 seconds to say the words that would have changed everything. On the morning of Chris's wedding, Grace's water broke. The nurses rushed her to labor and delivery. Her blood pressure spiked to stroke levels. The baby's heart rate dropped. Grace grabbed a nurse's phone with trembling hands and dialed one last time. Chris K was about to say, "I do," to the wrong woman. And the right one was dying 3 miles away, carrying his child. The right one was dying 3 miles away, and Chris K had no idea his entire world was about to explode on live television. The Grand Cathedral of Seoul had never looked more beautiful. 500 guests filled the pews. Flowers worth more than a car lined the aisle. Cameras from 3 major networks pointed at the altar where Chris stood in his custom black suit, tattooed hands clasped in front of him, waiting for the moment that would seal his fate. 3 miles away, Grace Norman lay in a hospital bed, an IV in her arm, monitors beeping frantically around her. She shouldn't have been watching. The nurses told her to rest, to breathe, to focus on the baby. But she couldn't look away from the small TV mounted on the wall showing Chris's wedding streaming live across Korea. A contraction ripped through her. Grace bit down on her lip to keep from screaming. The pain was getting worse. The baby was coming too fast. The monitors were beeping too loud. A doctor rushed in, checked her vitals, and his face went pale. "We need to prep for emergency surgery," he said. Now. On the TV, the priest smiled at Chris and Jessica. "You may now kiss the bride." Grace's vision blurred. She reached for the nurse's phone on the bedside table, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She dialed the number she'd memorized. The number that had rejected her 17 times. Please, she prayed. Please let him answer. In the cathedral, Chris leaned toward Jessica's perfectly painted lips. This was it. The moment that would lock him into a loveless life of business deals and cold handshakes and never feeling anything real again. Then Jin, his best man, rushed forward with Chris's phone. Boss, Jin whispered, loud enough for the microphones to catch. It's that scam caller again. Answer it. Embarrass them. Everyone's watching. Chris smirked. The guests leaned forward. This would be entertainment. He took the phone, raised it to his ear, his voice dripping with venom. You picked the wrong day to waste my... Mr. K? The nurse's voice was pure panic. Grace Norman is coding. We're losing her. She's 8 months pregnant, the baby's in distress, and she keeps saying your name. Are you family? We need consent for emergency procedures right now or they're both going to die. The cathedral went dead silent. Chris's smirk vanished. His tattooed hand turned white around the phone. Every camera in the room zoomed in on his face as the color drained from it. What? His voice cracked. Grace Norman, sir. Seoul General Hospital, room 304. She's been trying to reach you for weeks. The baby, sir, are you the father? 8 months pregnant. 8 months. The math slammed into Chris like a freight train. That night, 1 month before he fired her, she'd already been pregnant, but barely too early to show. And he'd been too stupid, too jealous, too cowardly to do the math. To ask, to listen when she tried to tell him. The baby was his. Grace was dying, and he'd ignored 17 calls because he was too much of a coward to face her. Where is she? Chris's voice broke. Jessica grabbed his arm. Chris, what is happening? Chris ripped his arm away. He looked at his mother's horrified face. His father rising from his seat, murder in his eyes. 500 guests staring. 3 cameras broadcasting his destruction live across Korea. He dropped the phone and ran. Chris had 30 minutes to save the woman he loved and the child he didn't know existed. But his family wasn't going to let him go without a fight. Chris's family wasn't going to let him go without a fight, but they'd never seen him move like a man possessed. He burst through the cathedral doors, ripped off his jacket, and sprinted to his car. Jin ran after him, tossing him the keys. Behind them, chaos erupted. Jessica screaming, his mother collapsing into a pew. His father's roar echoing off marble walls. 500 guests pulling out their phones, recording everything. Chris didn't care. He floored the accelerator. Seoul General Hospital was 7 minutes away. Chris made it in 4, running red lights, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might explode. He abandoned his car in the emergency lane and ran through the automatic doors still wearing his wedding tuxedo, his dress shoes slipping on the polished floors. Grace Norman, he gasped at the front desk. Room 304. Where is she? The nurse's eyes went wide. Sir, are you? Where is she? 3rd floor, labor and delivery, but sir, you can't. Chris was already gone, taking the stairs 3 at a time because the elevator was too slow. He burst onto the 3rd floor and saw it immediately. Room 304. Doctors and nurses rushing in and out. Machines beeping frantically. Someone shouting about blood pressure and fetal distress. Chris shoved through the door. Grace lay on the bed, her dark skin ashen, her beautiful face twisted in pain. She was hooked to monitors, IVs in both arms, an oxygen mask over her mouth. Her belly was enormous under the thin hospital gown. Her eyes were half closed. Grace. Chris's voice cracked. He stumbled to her bedside, grabbed her hand. Grace, I'm here. I'm so sorry. I'm here. Her eyes fluttered open. When she saw him, tears spilled down her cheeks. Chris, she whispered behind the mask. The baby. Sir, you need to leave. A doctor tried to pull him back. We're prepping for emergency surgery. I'm not leaving. Chris's grip on Grace's hand tightened. He looked at the doctor, his eyes wild. The baby. Is it mine? The doctor glanced at Grace. She nodded weakly. How far along is she? Chris demanded. 32 weeks. But she's been in preterm labor for hours. Preeclampsia. We need to deliver now or we'll lose them both. 32 weeks. 8 months. Chris did the math in his head. That night, their night, she'd already been pregnant but barely, maybe 4 weeks, too early to know, too early to see. And when he came back a month later and saw her belly at 3 months, he'd assumed the worst. He'd thrown her out, blocked her calls, let her suffer alone for 5 months while he planned a wedding to a woman he didn't love. Oh God. Chris's legs gave out. He collapsed into the chair beside Grace's bed, still holding her hand. Grace, I'm so sorry. I'm so stupid. I should have listened. I should have. Sir, we need consent. The doctor shoved a clipboard at him. Are you the father? Yes. Chris's voice was raw. He looked at Grace, at the woman he'd loved and ruined and abandoned. Yes, I'm the father. Do whatever you need to do. Save them. Please, save them both. Grace squeezed his hand weakly. Chris, she whispered, if something happens to me. Nothing's going to happen. Chris brought her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles, his tears falling onto her skin. You hear me, Grace Norman? Nothing's going to happen. You're going to survive this. You're going to be okay. And I'm never leaving you again. The doctors wheeled her toward the operating room. Chris tried to follow but a nurse stopped him. Sir, you need to wait here. No, I need to be with her. Sir, she's been alone for 5 months because of me. Chris's voice broke. I'm not letting her go through this alone too. They let him scrub in. But as the surgical doors closed behind them, Chris realized something terrifying. He'd spent his whole life controlling everything. And now, the 2 people he loved most were beyond his control. The 2 people Chris loved most were beyond his control, and his old life was about to come crashing through the hospital doors to destroy what was left of him. They wouldn't let him in the operating room. Too dangerous, the nurses said. Too much risk of infection. So Chris stood outside the surgery doors in his wedding tuxedo, blood pressure cuff marks on Grace's hand still visible on his dress shirt, watching through the small window as doctors worked frantically to save her. Save them. His daughter. He had a daughter fighting for her life in there. Chris K. Chris spun around. His father stormed down the hallway, his mother right behind him, Jessica trailing in her white wedding gown. Behind them, news cameras. Reporters. The circus had followed them here. What the hell do you think you're doing? His father's voice boomed through the waiting room. Other families stared. You abandoned your wedding. On live television. Do you understand what you've done to this family? I don't care. Chris's voice was hollow. You don't. His father's face turned purple. You humiliated us. You humiliated the Newmans. You destroyed a merger 6 months in the making. I said I don't care. Jessica pushed past his father, her perfect makeup ruined by tears of rage. You left me at the altar for your maid? Your pregnant maid? She's not my maid. Chris's hands clenched into fists. She's the woman I love. And that's my child in there. Jessica's hand cracked across his face. The slap echoed through the hallway. You're pathetic. You're throwing away everything for some. Finish that sentence, Chris said quietly, his eyes going dark. I dare you. Jessica's mouth snapped shut. Even she knew better than to cross that line. Chris's mother stepped forward, her voice cold as ice. If you stay here, you're no longer my son. No inheritance. No protection. No family name. You'll be nothing. Chris looked at the surgery doors. At the woman fighting for her life behind them. At the daughter he'd almost never known. Then he looked at his parents, at Jessica, at the cameras recording every second of his destruction. Then I'm nothing. His voice didn't shake. Because my family is in that room. Not out here. You're making the biggest mistake of your life, his father spat. No. Chris met his eyes. My biggest mistake was letting her go the first time. I'm not making it again. His mother turned away, tears streaming down her face. His father grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the elevator. Jessica ripped off her diamond engagement ring and threw it at Chris's feet. You'll regret this, she hissed. Then they were gone. The cameras followed them. The hallway went quiet except for the beeping machines and hushed voices of other families waiting for news about their own loved ones. Chris sank into a plastic chair, put his tattooed face in his hands, and waited. 2 hours later, the surgery doors opened. A doctor walked out, exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in pink blankets. Mr. K? Chris stood up so fast he almost fell. Are they? Grace is stable. She's going to be okay. And your daughter? The doctor placed the baby in Chris's arms. 4 pounds, 3 ounces. Small but strong, just like her mother. Chris looked down at the tiny face peeking out from the blankets. His daughter had Grace's nose. His dark eyes. A head full of black curls. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. He collapsed to his knees right there in the hallway, still holding her, and sobbed. Chris K lost everything that day. His family, his empire, his name. But as he held his daughter for the first time, he realized he'd finally found what he'd been searching for his whole life. If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me what you think. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more stories like this. Don't forget to like and share. Chris K finally found what he'd been searching for his whole life. And it looked nothing like he'd imagined. 1 year later, Chris stood in the kitchen of a modest apartment in Itaewon, nowhere near the Gangnam mansion he used to call home. The place had 2 bedrooms, a small balcony, and walls thin enough to hear the neighbors arguing. It cost less per month than his old wardrobe budget. He'd never been happier. "Daddy, up," a tiny voice demanded from the living room. Chris smiled, set down the coffee he was making, and walked to where his daughter Lily sat surrounded by toys. She had Grace's dark skin, his sharp eyes, and a personality that terrified and delighted him in equal measure. At 1 year old, she was already running his life more efficiently than he'd ever run the Mafia. Up, up, up. Lily raised her chubby arms. Chris scooped her up, kissed her forehead, and carried her to the window. "Look, baby. It's snowing." Lily pressed her face to the glass, her breath fogging it up. Snow. Behind them, Grace emerged from the bedroom wearing one of Chris's old t-shirts, her hair wrapped in a silk scarf, looking more beautiful than any woman in a designer gown ever had. She yawned, stretched, and smiled at the sight of Chris and Lily silhouetted against the window. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep." Chris shifted Lily to his hip. "I was thinking." "Dangerous." Grace walked over and kissed him softly. "Thinking about what?" "About how a year ago I was the most miserable man in Seoul. And now." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Now you live in a tiny apartment, drive a used car, and run a small security consulting business that makes a fraction of what you used to." "Now I have everything." Chris pulled her close with his free arm, Lily giggling between them. "I have you. I have her. I have mornings that don't start with blood under my nails. I have nights where I actually sleep instead of planning my next move. I have a normal life?" Grace finished, smiling. A real life. It hadn't been easy. Chris's family did exactly what they promised. Cut him off completely. His father took over the organization and erased Chris's name from every record like he'd never existed. The Newman family sued for damages. The press had a field day. "Mafia boss abandons wedding for pregnant maid," was a headline for months. But Chris didn't care. He'd liquidated his personal accounts before his family could freeze them, found this apartment, and started a legitimate security consulting business with Jin, the only friend who'd stuck by him. It was smaller, quieter, legal, perfect. Grace started singing while she made breakfast, one of her gospel songs that had haunted Chris for a year before he'd finally admitted why. Lily clapped along, offbeat but enthusiastic. Chris watched them, his chest tight with something he'd never felt in his old life. Peace. His phone buzzed. A text from Jin. "Got 3 new clients. Business is good, boss." Chris smiled. Not boss, like he used to be. Just a man running an honest business with his best friend, coming home to a woman who loved him and a daughter who thought he hung the moon. "Chris?" Grace looked at him, concern in her eyes. "You okay?" "Yeah." Chris set Lily down and wrapped both arms around Grace, pulling her against him. "I'm just thinking about how I do it all again. Every mistake, every stupid decision, every moment of pain, because it led me here." Grace kissed him, slow and soft. "Even the part where you blocked my calls 17 times? Especially that part." Chris grinned. "Gave me something to apologize for every day for the rest of my life." "Smart man." Lily tugged on Chris's pants. "Daddy, hungry?" Chris laughed, scooped her up again, and carried her to the kitchen. Through the window, Seoul stretched out below them, glittering and vast and full of people chasing power and status and everything Chris used to think mattered. He didn't miss it for a second. Because Chris K wasn't a mafia boss anymore. He was a father, a partner, a man who'd burned down his entire empire for love. And he'd do it again in a heartbeat. Thank you for watching. If you loved Chris and Grace's story, please like, comment, and subscribe for more. What story should I tell next? Drop your suggestions below.